It's my pleasure to introduce this year's Shaffer Lecture, Professor John Meier, and most of you have heard his first two lectures this week. And as Dean Attridge mentioned in his introduction, Professor Meier has a licentiate, which is kind of like a master's degree, and a doctorate from universities in Rome. And he achieved not only highest honors in both those degrees, summa cum laude, but he also received a papal medal, a gold papal medal for each, and I'd love to see those sometime.
I think Rome wants them back, actually.
Professor Meier's first two lectures were marvels of clarity, sound judgment, and wit. He made the historical Jesus come alive in his careful analysis of texts and his reconstruction of the world in which Jesus lived. We look forward to his treatment today of a subject that was crucial to many ancient Jews, including many followers of Jesus. And I'd also like to remind you that immediately following this lecture, there will be time for conversation with Professor Meier. So let us welcome him again.
Thank you, Adele. That was just a lovely introduction. And yes, the two medals are carefully stored away in my bedroom, and I haven't seen any Vatican official come near yet to try to get them back. During my first two lectures on divorce in the South, I have marveled not only at your kind patience, but also at your positive engagement in what are admittedly long and complicated presentations. But I fear that today's subject matter could easily push Job himself beyond the point of endurance. For with the question of the historical Jesus and Jewish purity rules, we face a problem of critical mass. At present, my draft of the chapter on purity rules for Volume 4 of The Marginal Jew exceeds 230 pages of text. To present and argue for all the positions I take would require a 3-lecture series by itself, and you have suffered enough already. Since, however, God's providence and the Convocation schedule had placed this lecture on purity rules just before the general discussion of my presentations, I have decided to adopt a different format in this final lecture. Instead of laying out and defending all my opinions in detail, I will, metaphorically speaking, nail the equivalent of 95 theses onto the door of the Markman Chapel and ask for reactions, preferably not burning at the stake. Like the format of the medieval Thesis, which a noted theologian and Augustinian monk followed in 1517, these theses propose and briefly, I should try to stress briefly, explain positions I champion without laying out all the reasoning behind each thesis. Of their nature, then, these theses are meant to invite discussion and debate, both in order to tease out their rationale and also, hopefully, to offer corrections to my views when they are askew, and I'm sure they are sometimes. Since exactly 95 theses would reintroduce the problem of ever-increasing length, permit me to boil down my positions on Jesus and purity laws to a mere 15 theses. Luther on a slim, fast diet, though hardly the diet of worms. Thesis 1. One of the reasons for the difficulty of treating purity rules is the ferment in Jewish scholarship in the wake of the massive work of the two Jacobs, Jacob Neusder and Jacob Milgram. Jewish experts like Jonathan Clawins, Hannah Harrington, Chaim Maccabee, Charlotte Fon Robert, and Christine Hayes argue about the purity laws among themselves, as well as criticize previous research, both Jewish and Christian. It is no wonder that anthropologists like Mary Douglas have changed their positions on Jewish purity rules in the light of all this recent work by Jewish scholars. It is imperative that any quest for the historical Jesus at least listen in on the Jewish conversation, though preferably don't get caught in between the fights. Thesis 2. Without canonizing any one recent Jewish scholar, I think a combination of the work of Clawins and Hayes provides a serviceable pedagogical tool or heuristic structure for understanding Old Testament purity laws. Accordingly, I would distinguish 4 types of impurity in the Old Testament. First, ritual impurity, usually a temporary and often unavoidable condition, is by no means sinful or evil in itself. It results from the normal cycle of human life: birth, sexual activity, disease, and death. These powerful liminal events need to be cordoned off from, separated from the realm of the divine and holy, from the God who is himself the total antithesis of the birth-death cycle. In order to pass from the state of ritual impurity to the state of purity that allowed access to the temple, certain ritual actions were required, notably various ablutions. Second, moral impurity, in the legal sense found in the Pentateuch, shares the same Hebrew vocabulary of clean, tahor, and unclean, tameh, as does ritual impurity. Moral impurity refers to certain heinous sins like murder, idolatry, and incest. Such a sin is to'eva, an abomination. Unlike ritual impurity, moral impurity is eminently avoidable. And unlike ritual impurity, it is not communicated to another by touch, nor can it be removed by ordinary ritual actions like ablutions. Since moral impurity defiles the land of Israel and or the temple, and since, if not dealt with, it could ultimately cause the people of Israel to be expelled from their land, the perpetrator must be cut off from the people. One should note as an aside, though, that especially in the prophets and the Psalms, purity or impurity is extended by way of metaphor to include any sort of moral or immoral action or attitude. Immoral actions that are impure in this metaphorical sense do not have the legal effects and do not demand the precise legal remedies of ritual and moral impurity in the strict sense. A third category that floats between ritual and moral impurity is the list of animals prohibited for use as food. The total prohibition of eating, for example, pork, refers to a voluntary and perfectly avoidable act. To eat pork is to'eva, abomination, thus pushing this kind of impurity in the direction of moral impurity rather than ritual impurity. Yet it is never claimed that eating such food defiles the land or the sanctuary, and no precise punishment, like being cut off, is prescribed. Indeed, no remedy for the act is mentioned at all. The food laws thus constitute a legal corpus unto themselves within the purity laws. Fourth, a new type of impurity, genealogical impurity, appears rather late in the book of Ezra after the exile. Genealogical impurity results from intermarriage between Gentiles and any Israelite. Previously, the prohibition of intermarriage held only for priests. This innovation became a major point of contention among Jews around the turn of the era. Granted the bewildering complexity of the various purity laws, it is unlikely, in my opinion, that any one theory from the social sciences concerning the origin and function of these laws can explain the whole range of these practices. And the notable shift of Mary Douglas in recent years from her former views is perhaps a wise warning to us all. Thesis 3. The purity laws were not fixed immutably in stone in the Pentateuch. They continued to develop and became hotly contested topics in Judaism around the turn of the era. Some zealous groups, notably Qumran and the Essenes, sought to extend and intensify purity rules, as can be seen, for example, in the Rule of the Community, the Damascus Document, the Temple Scroll, and the many fragmentary purity rules found in Cave 4 at Qumran. The Pharisees likewise developed special purity regulations for their movement, though not to the same degree as the Essenes. Apparently other Jews, especially in the diaspora, tended to limit purity observances to what was strictly enjoined by the Torah and to accommodate them to the lives of ordinary people living in a sea of Gentiles without close recourse to the temple in Jerusalem. Thesis 4. It is within this ongoing debate that the views of the historical Jesus on purity must be located. However, when we focus on the four Gospels, we are struck almost immediately by a surprising fact. If we restrict ourselves to sayings that most likely go back to the historical Jesus, what stands out most of all is his silence on most purity laws. Genealogical impurity is simply not discussed. As for moral impurity, Jesus, like the Old Testament prophets and Psalms, uses the language of pure and impure metaphorically for good and evil actions and attitudes in general. But when it comes to moral impurity in the strict legal Pentateuchal sense of murder, idolatry, and sexual sins like incest, Jesus never treats the problem of the specific impurity that arises from such abominations. We are left then with the two categories of ritual impurity and the food laws. Even here, there is only one passage of notable length on these two topics, namely Mark 7:1-23, which once again the marvelous staff here has kindly given out for you with the Matthean parallel. Beyond this one text, Mark 7 with the Matthew 15 parallel, we have only a few scattered sayings touching on the disparate purity issues. So, not surprisingly, therefore, a good number of our theses will be looking at this key text. Thesis 5. It is no wonder that Mark 7:1-23 has generated a welter of lengthy articles and monographs. Almost all commentators would admit that we have here a number of blocks of tradition on different subjects that a redactor has welded together. The pericope divides into two major parts. The first half, a dispute story, is held together by the theme of criticizing the tradition of the elders. It stretches from Mark 7, verse 1, down to verse 13. The first unit of part 1, verses 1-5, recounts the question of the Pharisees and scribes about Jesus' disciples eating bread with defiled koinos, that is, unwashed hands, contrary to the tradition of the elders. The second unit, verses 6-13, narrates Jesus' two replies. In the first subunit of this reply, verses 6-8, Jesus answers by quoting Isaiah 29:13, accusing his opponents of neglecting the commandment of God while holding to the tradition of men. In the second subunit, verses 9-13, Jesus replies by quoting Exodus 20:12 and 21:17, and by setting the obligation of honoring one's parents over against the legal subterfuge of Korban. In the center of the pericope lies the pivot of verses 14 to 15, in which Jesus teaches the crowd the key aphorism that nothing outside a person can defile that person by entering within. Only what comes out of a person defiles that person. That is the first half of our grand pericope. Then in the second half of the pericope, verses 17 to 23, Jesus explains in private to his disciples his aphorism on defilement. In the first unit, verses 17 to 18a, the inquiring disciples are rebuked for their lack of understanding. We are in Mark's Gospel. In the second unit, verses 18b to 19, the first half of the aphorism is explained. Nothing from outside can defile a person because it simply passes through the stomach into the latrine. The narrator adds at this point that in saying this, Jesus made all foods clean. In the third subunit, verses 20 to 23, the second half of the aphorism is explained. Things from within a person do defile the person. This point is illustrated with a list of vices well known in the epistles of the New Testament. Under the general rubric of evil thoughts, the list catalogs 6 evil actions in the plural, and then 6 evil actions or attitudes in the singular. The entire pericope ends in verse 23 with the generalizing conclusion, all these evil things come forth from within and defile a person. Thus, Mark 7:1 to 23, as you can see, is a bundle of disparate subjects wrapped up in one large pericope, something like the sort of wrap you might get at one of the food stands outside on Prospect Avenue at lunchtime. Well, let's try to unwrap the Markan wrap. Thesis 6. One reason why we do not feel completely overwhelmed by a chaotic mass of heterogeneous material when we read 7:1 to 23 is that Mark, or perhaps a pre-Markan redactor, has done a skillful job stitching together the separate units and subunits into a literary, if not a theological, whole. Quite obvious to any Markan scholar is a typical Markan pattern that acts as an overarching grid. First, Jesus delivers some public, puzzling teaching. Then he withdraws into private, where he first rebukes the disciples for their lack of understanding and then explains his teaching to them alone. Helping to tie these two major parts together are a number of verbal links, such as the Greek adjective koinos, defiled or impure, and anthropos, human being. It's interesting to notice how that holds, in a sense, the entire large pericope together. Verbal links within units include phrases like, especially in the first part, the Pharisees, tradition, annul, abandon, commandments, honor, and then especially in the second half, eat, come in and come out, defile and understand, as well, of course, being Mark, a lack of understanding. Alongside these verbal links are signs of redactional activity, be it of Mark or a pre-Markan author. These include intrusive parenthetical explanations and asides, generalizing or universalizing statements sprinkled with all or many, the tendency to string together a series of verbs of saying, we saw that yesterday, and finally, Mark's habit of saying things in twos, Markan duality. If it sounds good once, we'll say it a second time. Quite clearly then, Mark 7:1 to 23 is, as it stands, a complicated Christian composition that has probably gone through a number of stages of tradition and redaction. The last thing we should ever do is take Mark 7:1 to 23 and say, aha, here is the position of the historical Jesus. It is a Christian composition. For simplicity's sake, in what follows, I will speak of Mark or the redactor, fully realizing that there may be more than one level of redaction here. But since our concern is what, if anything, goes back to the historical Jesus, distinguishing the various stages of Christian redaction, is not of primary importance. Once an element of the pericope is judged redactional on whatever level of redaction, by definition, it does not come from the historical Jesus, which is our sole concern here. Thesis 7. Granted the heterogeneous nature of the different units that have been stitched together, it is best to sift each unit in turn to test whether it contains an authentic saying of Jesus. Now, ordinarily, one would simply proceed in the order in which the units have been laid out by Mark. As we hear in Alice in Wonderland, begin at the beginning and when you come to the end, stop. However, the first unit, verses 1 to 5, presents us with a special case here compared to other dispute stories. In the lengthy verses 1 to 5, Jesus neither speaks nor acts. He's hardly there except as a point of reference for the disciples. The unit is entirely taken up with the actions and words of the Pharisees and scribes, who react to actions not of Jesus himself, but to some of Jesus' disciples. Inserted into verses 3 and 4 is a lengthy polemical parenthesis describing the supposed purity practices of all the Jews, talking about a rather wide cannon blast, an obviously polemical and not terribly accurate salvo from the Christian narrator. Jesus begins to speak only in the second unit, verses 6 to 13. But from there on in, the rest of verses 6 to 23 is taken up almost entirely with the direct discourse of Jesus and Jesus alone. Really, from verse 6 onwards, it's hardly a strike gesprek, because nobody else is really speaking at all. It's just Jesus. Since our quest is for the historical Jesus and not the historical Mark or his historical predecessors or even the historical Pharisees or scribes here, I think it is best to begin methodologically with the second unit in verse 6, move through all the subsequent units of Jesus' speech, and return at the end of the process to verses 1 to 5. At that point, we will be in a better position to evaluate this difficult first unit. Thesis 8. As we have seen, the second unit of the pericope, verses 6 to 13, is made up of two replies by Jesus. The first reply to the Pharisees' question is made up almost entirely of a four-line quotation from Isaiah 29:13, Mark 7:6 to 7, followed by a brief application of the quotation to the tradition of the Pharisees. Some critics would a priori brand any Old Testament citation in the mouth of Jesus as a Christian creation. However, considering that Jesus was, if nothing else, a Jewish teacher who engaged in public disputes with various Jewish groups, I find the idea that he never cited the Jewish scriptures in his arguments highly unlikely, and in volumes 2 and 3 of A Margin of Jew, I present a number of places where I think indeed he does. And yet, there's always an and yet, we are dealing here with a special case of scripture citation. The form of Isaiah 29:13, used in Mark 7:6 to 7, is not from the Masoretic text of the Hebrew. Indeed, it is not found in any other textual tradition of Isaiah in Hebrew or Aramaic that is known to us. The wording Jesus employs is found only in the Greek Septuagint. Now, in itself, this proves nothing about historicity. The historical Jesus could well have cited Isaiah in Hebrew or Aramaic, and Mark would have naturally used the Septuagint of Isaiah when he formulated the story in Greek, simply saying, aha, this is the Septuagint text, doesn't tell us anything, except Mark is writing in Greek, and that's the Bible he would use. The problem, though, is that in this specific case, the Septuagint version alone contains changes in the wording and line of thought that are essential to Jesus' argument against the Pharisees. Aha! For example, in the Masoretic text, Isaiah is criticizing the people of Israel in general, as they stream into the Jerusalem temple. He is criticizing them precisely for being religious, for engaging in the religious routine of temple liturgy set up by kings and priests, a commandment of men learned by rote. The prescribed prayers are duly recited with their mouths in the temple, but their hearts are far from the God present in the temple. While there are divergences from the Masoretic text in the Isaiah text of Qumran and in the later Aramaic Targum of Isaiah, the grammatical structure and theological message are basically the same in all these texts. By contrast, there is a notable shift in structure and meaning in the Septuagint. For instance, what is merely an initial statement of cause in the Masoretic text, because this people honors me with their lips, becomes the main clause, as is the case in the Septuagint, and indeed the whole point at issue in Mark. In addition, Mark uses a shortened form of Isaiah 29:13 precisely to focus on the last clause of the verse, the clause that diverges most notably in its Septuagintal form from the Hebrew. In the Septuagint, the people who are criticized worship in vain because they teach commandments of men, that is, mere human commandments. Hence, what was in the Hebrew simply a denunciation of mechanical routine liturgy in the Jerusalem temple engaged in by all the people, now expands and is differentiated in the Septuagint into a denunciation of merely human teaching rather than merely human liturgy. In doing this, the Septuagint implicitly introduces the idea of a group of people who do the teaching within the whole people of Israel, while the whole people in the original Hebrew text of Isaiah are the sole object of Isaiah's rebuke in the Hebrew. Mark proceeds in verse 7 to reformulate the Septuagint's inventive translation. Instead of the Septuagint's somewhat awkward teaching commandments of men and teachings, whatever that means, it's a little bit. Obviously, the Septuagintal translator had his problems translating the Hebrew at this point, and we come up in the Septuagint with this rather strange teaching commandments of men and teachings. Mark instead, very cleverly, teases out an explicit opposition that is useful for his polemic. Mark's reworking of the Septuagint might be translated paraphrastically, teaching as divine teachings the commandments of mere men. That's not in the Hebrew of Isaiah, and that's not quite so precisely even in the Septuagint. But it's exactly what Mark needs for Jesus' argument in Mark 7. It is precisely this creative Septuagintal translation, as reworked by Mark, that Jesus seizes upon as he applies the Isaiah text to the Pharisees in verse 8. Neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men. Isaiah, says Jesus, uttered an exact prophecy of the Pharisees' distortion of God's commandment by human tradition, provided, of course, you read Isaiah through the Septuagint as reworked by Mark. It's very nice to do midrash on Scripture when you make the Scripture mean exactly what you want it to mean. The problem then is clear. Jesus' line of argument works only if Jesus has as a scriptural starting point the form of Isaiah 29:13 found only in the Septuagint and then reworked by Mark, a form not present in any Hebrew or Aramaic text. Our suspicions are only confirmed when we notice that a Christian polemic in Colossians 2:20-21 also reworks the Septuagintal form of Isaiah 29:13 to pursue a similar line of argument. Apparently, the Septuagintal form of Isaiah 29:13 circulated among early Christians as a proof text for rejecting purity rules, especially those concerned with touching or eating food. Interestingly, the next verse Isaiah 29:14, is cited by Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:19 and is alluded to by Matthew in Matthew 11:25. In sum, the most likely conclusion is that the second unit of Mark 7, verses 6 to 8, is a Christian creation, a prime example of Christian midrash. Thesis 9. Our decision that Jesus' first reply in verses 6 to 8 is a Christian composition has immediate consequences for the second reply of verses 9 to 13, the second subunit. In the present structure of 7:1 to 23, verses 9 to 13 function as the concrete example illustrating the general principle asserted in verses 6 to 8. The Pharisees are accused of using the institution of Korban to supersede the basic obligation in the Decalogue of honoring one's father and mother. In both vocabulary and content, the framing verses of Jesus' second reply betray Mark's redactional hand. Mark neatly slides from the vocabulary of the commandments of men to the tradition of men, and finally to your tradition, to emphasize that the practice of Korban is a concrete fulfillment of what Isaiah prophesied concerning the Pharisees' teaching. It would appear then that at least in the present form and the present setting of the subunit, verses 9 to 13 is a formulation of a Christian redactor. Verses 9 to 13 are bound by rhetorical hoops of steel to the argument from Isaiah 29:13 in the first subunit. This does not mean, however, that the argument about Korban, if we isolate it from Mark's larger pericope, might not reflect some halakhic teaching of the historical Jesus. The core saying in verses 10 to 12, unlike the Septuagintal text of Isaiah 29:13, fits very well into the time and place of Jesus. Various Jewish groups around the turn of the era were engaged in lively debate over oaths and vows, including the problem of conflicting obligations arising from them. Indeed, the Damascus document in 16:14 to 20 may condemn the subterfuge of vowing one's food to sacred use in order to keep it from a neighbor in need. That the actual word korban circulated in Aramaic around the time of Jesus is now testified to by an Aramaic inscription on an ossuary dated from the end of the 1st century BCE. The Aramaic inscription actually echoes the terminology of Mark 7:11. The inscription speaks of what might be to another person's profit or use, and then forbids such use because of a prior dedication to God. The institution and the word korban were apparently so prominent in 1st century Judaism that twice in his works, Josephus explains the institution, each time using first the Aramaic word korban and then translating it just as Mark does with the Greek noun doron, gift. Philo likewise knows the institution and holds to the irrevocability of a vow even when it works to the detriment of members of one's family. Notice the particular problem that resurfaces. As late as 200 CE, the Mishnah preserves various contending views on Korban, and on the grounds that would justify the annulling of a vow that a man had made to the detriment of his father and mother. It apparently was a real problem. The trajectory of all these texts on Korban, or vows in general, places Jesus' pronouncement on Korban squarely within the time period when the issue was debated among Palestinian Jews. Realistically, either the core teaching in Mark 7:10 to 12 goes back to the historical Jesus, or the argument is a creation of Aramaic-speaking Christian Jews in Palestine during the first few decades of the Christian movement's existence. While either explanation is possible, the absence of any concern or debate about the relatively obscure topic of Korban anywhere else in early Christian literature inclines me to think that the saying about Korban comes from Jesus himself. The upshot is a confirmation of our portrait of the halakhic Jesus, who engaged in legal debate not only on major issues like divorce and Sabbath, but even on minor questions like the abuse of Korban. It also confirms our supposition that Jesus at times cited the scriptures in his arguments. Notice his love always of the Decalogue. No divorce because the rule about adultery in the Decalogue. Korban must not be abused because of honor your father and mother in the Decalogue. It's not that Jesus has some systematic rules about Decalogue, but notice automatically he tends to go back and appeal to that as a touchstone. Thesis 10. As we come to the second half of the pericope, we should realize that in weighing the authenticity of the sayings in verses 15 to 23, everything hangs on the authenticity of verse 15. For if the two-part aphorism on what defiles in verse 15 comes from the historical Jesus, then it may well be that at least the core of the two-part explanation in verses 18b to 23 comes from Jesus as well. If, however, verse 15, the font from which the whole second half of the pericope springs, if verse 15 is not authentic, it becomes extremely difficult to defend the authenticity of verses 18b to 23. Hence, in what follows, we must focus on verse 15, a two-part aphorism that reads 15a, there is nothing outside a human being that by entering into him can defile him. 15b, but those things that come out of a human being are the things that defile him. Put in very general terms, anthropos is used there throughout, human being. What is said here is true of the human condition in general, not just a question of purity rules affecting either male or female. Anthropos, the human being. Thesis 11. There are certainly good arguments in favor of accepting Mark 7:15 as authentic, and many scholars do. Bill Loder, whom I referred to already, has a very extensive treatment on that, and he and I, in a colloquium down at Perth, Australia last year, got into a rather heated debate over this very point, but never too heated. Australians are marvelously polite people. But many good scholars, like Bill Loder, do hold to the historicity of Mark 7:15 as authentic, coming from the historical Jesus. And as I say, they have very strong arguments in their favor. First, verse 15 is a disturbing, subversive aphorism cast in two-part antithetical parallelism, a style typical of Jesus' sayings. Second, discontinuity from the Judaism of Jesus' day, so much of which elevated and expanded purity rules, likewise argues for authenticity. Third, at the same time, within first century Judaism, Jesus' aphorism is intelligible in the mouth of a Jewish prophet. For Jesus' declaration, says the defender like Bill Loder, Jesus' declaration should not be understood as absolute or exclusive in the sense of not X but Y, as we might take it, but rather in a relative sense, namely, Y is more important than X. This Semitic rhetorical style, known technically as dialectical negation, is famously exemplified in Hosea 6:6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Now, Hosea is not anticipating in that verse 18th century Enlightenment religion that demanded the abolition of all cult and cultic sacrifice and external religion. No, Hosea is rather setting priorities. Mercy towards one's neighbor is much more important than cultic sacrifice, though the latter is not totally rejected. Without temples, what forum would most of the Old Testament prophets have for their various speeches? Hence, in Mark 7:15, Jesus, says Bill Loder and many others, Jesus is not totally rejecting the food laws, but is rather emphasizing the much greater importance of avoiding moral impurity. Fourth, this point is suggested by a general pattern in Jesus' antithetical statements, a pattern called end stress. Namely, the emphasis in many of Jesus' two-part statements fall usually on the second half of the statement. Therefore, the emphasis in verse 15 is on the end, on moral defilement coming from within. That's what Jesus is emphasizing. Fifth, some scholars support this mild interpretation of the saying by claiming that we have the original form of Jesus' aphorism not in Mark 7:15, but rather in Matthew 15:11, hence the use of the parallel in your handout there. Because Matthew 15:11 has a softer tone. Notice we don't have the fierce Mark, and there is nothing that can defile. Matthew usually tones down Mark. So we have in Matthew 15:11, not what enters into the mouth defiles a human being, but what comes out of the mouth. That defiles a human being. All the Matthean touches there. He inserts the Greek noun stoma, a favorite noun of his. The antithetical balance is made much more precise, and the whole tone is a little bit milder. Most important, though, and perhaps it isn't as clear in English as it is in the Greek, is the absence of Mark's fierce, absolute wording, there is nothing that can defile. That is dropped by Matthew. But some, like Loda, would say Matthew may represent rather the original form of the saying. Moreover, some claim that this Matthean form enjoys multiple attestation, since we find a supposedly independent form of the saying in the Coptic Gospel of Thomas at the end of Logion 14. What goes into your mouth will not defile you, but what comes out of your mouth, that is what will defile you. This Thomas form is indeed very close to that of Matthew 15:11. Notice the occurrence of the word mouth, the resumptive that will defile you, no use of nothing that can. And as noted already, this milder form is perfectly intelligible in the mouth of a Jewish prophet, be he Hosea or Jesus. It's not a question of absolute negation, it is relative negation setting priorities. So far, my friend Bill Loder. Thesis 12, a contra. In my opinion, this reminds me of always the great philosophical and theological Latin textbooks we would use in Rome, where you always listed the opinions of your adversary, and then a contrapart would usually start, sed secundum sanctum Thomam et veritatem, but according to St. Thomas and the truth, we should rather say. I'm not making up, that was really literally what were in some of the textbooks. So, secundum me, in my opinion, and the truth. Still, weightier arguments favor the view that Mark 7:15 does not go back to Jesus, but is a creation of the early church. Now, admit these arguments become at certain points quite complicated and technical. Permit me to try to just sketch out an ever brief outline of the arguments that really demand much greater treatment. First, many antithetical statements in the Bible do have the exclusive sense of not X but Y. For example, Deuteronomy 5:13 commands, 6 days you shall do all your work, but on the 7th day you shall not do any work. That hardly means, well, you should do more work on the first 6 days and not quite so much work on the 7th. No. It is an absolute Kierkegaardian entweder oder, either or there. And the Old Testament knows a lot of those exclusive forms of negation. The same absolute antithesis is found in sayings in Mark himself. For example, 2:17, it is not the healthy who need a doctor but the sick, and famously 10:45, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Hence, while Mark 7:15 might be interpreted as dialectical negation, that interpretation is by no means necessary. One must attend to the content of the individual saying. Second, end stress is not an invariable rule in the sayings of Jesus. In the case of Mark 7:15, insisting on end stress misses the slightly unbalanced nature of the saying. The first half of the verse makes a sweeping, emphatic statement about the impossibility of an event. There is nothing outside a human being that can defile. Interestingly, this emphasis is not paralleled in the second half, which is comparatively bland. Those things that come out of a human being are the things that defile. No, nothing that can ever, etc. With the emphasis clearly on the first half of the verse, its sweeping nature is, I think, more naturally understood as absolute rather than relative. There is where the emphasis lies, not on the second half of the verse. Third, the claim that Matthew 15:11 plus Gospel of Thomas 14 represent an independent and indeed original form of the Logion ignores the telltale fingerprints of Matthean redaction that pervade Matthew's reworking of the whole of Mark 7:1-23 in Matthew 15:1-20. I would refer you to Gerhard Barth's famous essay on the understanding of law in Matthew's Gospel in that great Bornkamm-Barth-Held book on the interpretation of Matthew. He goes through typical German Grundtlick, plowing through verse by verse Matthew 15 vis-a-vis Mark 7, I think, shows quite conclusively that word for word verse, this is a laboratory test case of Matthew's stylistic rewriting of Mark. The same consistent Matthean style and theology that is found throughout Matthew's redactional reworking of Mark 7 is found likewise in his reworking of Mark 7:15. Matthew 15:11 betrays the same softening tone as well as the same tendency to tighten and balance material that Matthew employs elsewhere in his redaction of Mark 7 and indeed in his redaction of Mark in general. Within Matthew 15:11 itself, Matthew's redactional hand is seen both in the introduction of the characteristically Matthean word mouth, stoma, and just simply statistically among the Gospels, Matthew is the one who regularly inserts that word and uses it when it's not in it, so it's stoma, mouth. Among the Gospels, it is a typical Matthean redactional word. And also we see his hand in the abbreviation of the Markan Logion to create greater balance between the two halves of the saying. The presence of the Matthean into your mouth and out of your mouth in the two halves of the aphorism, the resumptive pronoun that in the second half of the saying, and the carefully balanced parallelism all reveal Matthew's fingerprints on Matthew 15:11. And the exact same Matthean fingerprints, perfect balance, introduction of the word mouth, apto in the Coptic, and even the resumptive pronoun at the end that Matthew introduces. The exact same Matthean fingerprints are found in Thomas 14, the academic dogma of Thomas's independence of the synoptics notwithstanding. Thus, we conclude that Mark 7:15 is the earliest available form of the Logion, a form that emphatically and absolutely declares that no food can defile a person. There is nothing that can defile. Thesis 13. Granted this conclusion about the original form of the saying, Matthew 7:15 most likely does not come from the historical Jesus. If authentic, this Logion would mean that with one fell stroke, Jesus abolished a whole corpus of purity laws in the Torah, laws that affected not just some Jews now and then, as with divorce, and not just all Jews every seventh day, as with the Sabbath, but rather all Jews every day of their lives. For purity laws, especially the food laws, set up some of the clearest and best known boundaries between Jews and Gentiles, boundaries inculcated in the way Jews handled one of the most basic experiences of life, eating. When one realizes the shattering impact of this logion, how it would be taken in by Jews, what it would mean for their Jewish existence, the radical change they would feel, the radical destruction of their existence, the reasons for questioning the saying's authenticity become clear. First, to begin with, unlike sayings on divorce and the Sabbath, Mark 7:15 enjoys no multiple attestation. Apart from it, nothing in the whole of the New Testament states that Jesus, during his public ministry, revoked the food laws. Second, moreover, unlike Jesus' prohibition of voluntary fasting, which had a visible impact on what his disciples did, hence the question about how is it your disciples don't fast. Unlike that prohibition of voluntary fasting, nowhere in the Gospels do Jesus and his disciples eat forbidden food. It was a teaching that, strangely, they don't act on. Third, in fact, strange to say, unlike so many of Jesus' pronouncements and actions, Mark 7:15 calls forth no response whatever from Jesus' opponents or the crowds of followers. Think how in so many stories, be it strike for strike, be it a miracle story, that at the end, of course, there's always the choral conclusion. The enemies are frustrated or put to shame, or they're foaming at the mouth, or the crowd rejoices and said a prophet. You usually have some reaction to what Jesus does. The intriguing thing here, this is the most astounding thing Jesus says in the gospel, and no reaction from it. No, not even an eyelid is raised. What is going on here? In other words, the total lack of reverberation of this astounding revocation of key Mosaic commandments raises serious questions about its authenticity. Fourth, this lack of reverberation in the Gospels is matched by a lack of reverberation of Mark 7:15 in the history of the first Christian generation. And perhaps this is the most important point. Both Paul and the Acts of the Apostles struggle with the question of whether Gentile converts should observe the food laws. For all the differences in their approaches, and indeed there are many differences between Paul and Acts of the Apostles in the approach to the food laws, nevertheless, neither Paul nor Luke, nor apparently anyone in the first Christian generation thought to appeal to what Jesus supposedly said on the subject. To claim that Mark 7:15 is authentic, we have to suppose a very strange Traditionsgeschichte here, a very strange history of the transmission of the same. We have to suppose that after being spoken by the historical Jesus, Mark 7:15 went mysteriously underground, remained unknown to Paul, and seemingly to anyone else involved in the food controversy that racked the first Christian generation, only to miraculously resurface in Mark's gospel and then never to be heard from again in the New Testament. Strange tradition history. In particular, we have to suppose that when the famous food fight broke out at Antioch between Peter and Paul, Antioch is apostolic animal house, neither Paul, nor Peter, nor Barnabas, nor anyone who had shared in the public ministry of Jesus remembered Jesus' shocking revocation of the food laws, despite its obvious relevance to the present dispute. That somehow miraculously around the year 70, Mark did remember the saying. How convenient. This lack of a Wirkungsgeschichte, this lack of an impact in the first Christian generation is perhaps the most weighty argument against the authenticity of Mark 7:15. This decision against authenticity relieves us happily of the burden of examining in detail Mark 7:17 to 23. After all, if the key statement in Mark 7:15 is a Christian creation, then it follows necessarily that so is the extended explanation and application of the logion in verses 17 to 23. Thesis 14. The reason for my initial and strange strategy of postponing consideration of Mark 7, 1 to 5 to the end of our treatment should by now be clear. Our examination of Mark 7, 1 to 23 has shown that, with the possible exception of the stray tradition about Korban in verses 10 to 12, the whole of verses 6 to 23 is the product of Christian tradition and Markan redaction. But, as they now stand in chapter 7 of Mark, verses 1 to 5 exist and have meaning only as an introduction to the dispute story that continues in verses 6 to 23, verses that do not come from the historical Jesus, or so I claim. And apart from the connections Mark has redactionally created, or the connections created by imaginative modern exegetes, Mark 7, 1 to 5 could hardly act as the direct introduction to the Korban saying in verses 10 to 12. Thus, there is no historical Jesus tradition for which verses 1 to 5 can serve as an introduction. In other words, if verses 6 to 23 are inauthentic, by inescapable logic, the verses that have as their only reason for being the function of serving as the entrance door into verses 6 to 23 are likewise inauthentic. This decision is further supported by the fact that the dispute in verses 1 to 5 presupposes that at least the Pharisees and some scribes held that hand washing before ordinary meals was obligatory for Jewish lay people at the time of Jesus. No such prescription can be documented in any pre-70 literature emanating from Palestinian Judaism. The first indisputable attestation of such an obligation is found in the Mishnah tractate Yadayim. And even there, the prescription is accompanied by countervailing opinions. Indeed, scattered opinions that hand washing before meals as opposed to after meals is not obligatory are found later on in the Tosefta, the Jerusalem Talmud, and even in Numbers Rabbah. In brief, both the composition history of Mark 7, 1 to 23 and the history of the development of Jewish purity rules indicate that almost all of the material in Mark 7, 1 to 23 comes from the early church, not from Jesus. Thesis 15. Without the bright light and interpretive framework given us by Mark 7, 1 to 23, the few scattered references to ritual purity in Jesus' other sayings and actions do not tell us very much. Perhaps more significant still is the silence of both the Jewish Jesus and the Christian narrator when it comes to many purity issues that would be of grave concern to most Palestinian Jews of Jesus' day. For example, first of all, corpse impurity was the most virulent of all forms of ritual impurity. The rabbis referred to it as the father of the fathers of impurity, the ultimate and strongest source of all impurity. Corpse impurity was contracted by anyone who touched a corpse, was in the same room as a corpse, or walked through a burial field. Yet in the stories of Jesus raising the dead, the problem of corpse impurity simply isn't on the evangelist radar screen, and no one brings it up. A woe against the scribes and the Pharisees that mockingly compares them to tombs or graves that defile is found in both Matthew 23, 27 to 28 and Luke 11, 44. But even if the saying, whose precise wording cannot be reconstructed, comes from Jesus, it tells us nothing specific about his own views on or observance of corpse impurity. Second, a somewhat similar cue saying in Matthew 23, 25 to 26 and Luke 11, 39 to 41 excoriates the Pharisees for cleaning the outside of the cup while inside the Pharisees themselves are full of greed and evil. By contrast, Jesus emphasizes the priority of inner cleanness over outer cleanness. Even if authentic, the saying tells us little about Jesus' own view of purity laws. In a way similar to the saying about the tomb-like Pharisees, this logion uses the issue of ritual purity on a metaphorical level and in a satirical way to inculcate the importance of inner moral purity. Third, the case of the woman with the flow of blood in Mark 5:25-34 is, properly speaking, not a case of menstrual purity, nidah, but of a woman with an abnormal and irregular genital discharge, zavah. Now, the purity laws of the Pentateuch and Leviticus do not explicitly state that a zavah communicates ritual impurity simply by touching someone, or a fortiori, in the case of Jesus, someone's clothing. Unless we suppose that ordinary Galilean peasants knew and observed the more rigorous rules of the Essenes, or anticipated the halakha of the later rabbis, there is no reason to think that either the woman or Jesus thought that impurity was being communicated by her touching his garment. Fourth, akin to the purity rules for a zavah were indeed the rules for a nidah, a menstruating woman. Interest in this purity question apparently increased around the turn of the era until it received a whole tractate in the Mishnah, the tractate Nidah. In stark contrast to this development is the total silence of Jesus and the Gospels on this pressing question. And one should be surprised that Jesus is totally silent on the issue. Let us remember that the itinerant Jesus had in his entourage not only a group of men, most of whom presumably experienced regular seminal emissions, along with, therefore, ritual impurity during sleep, if at no other time, but also a group of devoted women, many of whom would presumably be menstruating at various times of the month. When one considers the concrete problem of mutual ritual contamination by men and women living in close quarters on the road with no purifying pool mikvah available for total immersion, the complete silence of Jesus and the evangelists on these pressing purity issues is striking. When we put this together with the silence about corpse impurity, we begin to get the impression that Jesus was simply not interested in the questions of ritual purity that consumed the interest of many pious Jews of his time. Fifth, the same silence about purity is met in the story of Jesus touching the leper in Mark 1:40-45. But here we may have a situation similar to that of the zavah. The laws governing leprosy, actually, of course, we all know not leprosy in the sense of Hansen's disease, but various skin diseases and inflammations, but I'll use the word leprosy as the commonly used one. The laws governing leprosy in Leviticus 13-14 do not explicitly state that a person who touches a leper is rendered unclean. Even the halakhic material in the Dead Sea Scrolls does not clearly affirm that touching a leper makes a person unclean. And at least one fragmentary text from Cave 4 may indicate the opposite, as a priest has to inspect a leper to see whether he's clean or not, having to distinguish between every white or black hair on the whole body. Of course, the priest has to be touching. And there isn't the slightest concern that a priest, the most pure person of all, ritually, is touching a leper. This at Qumran, the ne plus ultra of purity maniacs, doesn't concern them apparently at all. The first glimmer of the idea that a person touching a leper renders himself unclean appears in Josephus's tractate against Apion, written towards the end of the 1st century CE, and even there it is not clear whether Josephus is engaging in polemical exaggeration, something he was wont to do. To be sure, Jesus commands the leper he cleanses in Mark 1 to show himself to a priest according to the law. But this doesn't tell us much about Jesus' view of ritual purity. From a practical point of view, the ostracized leper could not return to and be integrated into ordinary social and religious life without a clean bill of health, as it were, from the priest, who was the local health facility. In conclusion, then, we may at first be disappointed by the largely negative results of our investigation into Jesus and purity rules. In almost every pericope we have examined, not only is there no programmatic statement about ritual purity, there is simply an absence of or silence about the question, period. Granted the great debates about purity around the time of Jesus, the natural conclusion is that for Jesus, ritual purity was not only not a burning issue, it was not an issue at all. In this, there is a major difference between his views on purity on the one hand and his views on divorce and Sabbath on the other. What then is the upshot of our 3 Shaffer lectures on Jesus and the law? Did Jesus oppose or annul the Mosaic law as such? Certainly not. The Mosaic law was the given, the sacred canopy under which all Jewish debates about it take place. Rather, as our treatments of divorce, Sabbath, and purity rules indicate, it is, I think, a basic mistake to try to find one coherent line of thought or systematic approach to the law on the part of Jesus. Christian theologians in particular are often driven by a desire to find some principle from which Jesus' teaching on the law can be derived or on which these teachings are based. Love is perennially the favorite candidate. All you need is love, as a once famous rock group once told us. Now, of course, one hates to be against love, but here is one of the most common forms not only of Christianizing Jesus, but also of turning his halakhic teachings into a system of moral theology or Christian ethics. The historical Jesus was an itinerant eschatological prophet and wonder worker along the lines of Elijah. In other words, he was a religious charismatic. Such people implicitly or explicitly claim to know directly and intuitively God's will in particular situations. Hence, at least in the bedrock traditions we can attribute to Jesus with fair certitude, Jesus usually does not reason to his teaching. He does not derive it from some principle or invoke some great other teacher as his authority. There is no prophetic, the word of the Lord came to me saying, or Rabbi X said in the name of Rabbi Y. As the final prophet sent by God to Israel, Jesus knows that he knows God's will, and that's the end of that. An attitude summed up perfectly in his charismatic, apodictic, and apparently unparalleled, Amen, I say to you. It's so because I say it so. In sum, then, Jesus' studied indifference to ritual impurity, and indeed all of Jesus' specific teachings on halakhic questions, stem not from some grand theory about or system of law, but rather from his self-understanding as the charismatic prophet of the end time. Hopefully, our appreciation and appropriation of this basic insight will purify us of the original sin of Christianizing or systematizing the historical Jesus. Thank you very much for your kind attention.